The headline broke just before dawn. Trump moves to block AI chip exports, not just to China, but to other countries of concern. It was framed as a bold stand for national security, but within hours, global markets trembled. In Munich, a small startup called Neural Edge froze its procurement plans. Their CEO, Maria Alvarez, stared at her screen. A shipment of NVIDIA H100 GPUs had just been canceled. She sighed. Ordering GPUs now feels like fighting for baby formula in an empty supermarket. Her frustration wasn't unique. Across Europe and Southeast Asia, founders, data engineers, and manufacturers scrambled to understand the new reality. The White House statement sounded simple. We cannot allow adversaries to leap ahead in AI. Yet Trump's sweeping language and many other countries sent shockwaves through allies who once saw Washington as predictable. The ban expanded the previous export controls to include not just China, but potentially Vietnam, Singapore, the UAE, and even some EU partners suspected of re-exporting chips. Overnight, thousands of cloud computing startups and research labs found themselves on uncertain ground. Investors panicked. NVIDIA shares dipped, while competitors in Taiwan and South Korea faced export reviews so strict they were practically embargoes. Analysts warned this wasn't a targeted strike, it was a blanket freeze. You don't cut off oxygen to your allies when you're trying to fight a fire, one European trade official remarked anonymously. Trump, at a rally in Ohio, called it a patriotic move to protect American innovation from thieves. The crowd roared. But in Brussels, Tokyo, and Singapore, the tone was colder. Diplomats quietly called it Trump's tech nationalism 2, a replay of his trade war tactics, but this time aimed at the heart of the digital economy. For companies like Maria's, the effect was immediate. Their AI quality control line, designed to detect micro defects in car sensors, ran on US chips. Without them, production slowed. If we switch to Chinese hardware, she said, we lose performance and risk sanctions. If we wait, we lose customers. In Washington, advisors argued it was a necessary sacrifice. One official said, we can't build the future of AI on foreign dependency. But what the administration didn't have and desperately needed was a coordinated supply chain packed with allies. Without it, the policy became a domino effect of disruption. By week's end, cloud providers in Europe reported delays, data centers in Singapore rationed compute time, and research labs in Canada paused major AI training runs. This is not about national security anymore, one EU minister told reporters. It's about control. The US had drawn a new line in Silicon, and no one knew exactly which side they stood on. As the dust settled, the markets began to realize this wasn't a temporary shock, it was structural. Trump's new Blackwell restriction, named after NVIDIA's next generation AI chip, effectively tore through the fabric of global tech collaboration. It wasn't just about China anymore. The White House refused to release the full list of affected countries, creating what analysts dubbed the fog of compliance. For global investors, that fog was lethal. Venture capital funds pulled back from AI startups in Singapore and Berlin, unsure if their servers would still be legal next quarter. U.S. suppliers suspended shipments until further clarification, a euphemism for chaos. Maria watched as her procurement officer refreshed the NVIDIA dashboard, request denied. The system didn't even offer an explanation. Her engineers tried to switch to alternative chips from AMD and South Korea's SK Hynix, but export licenses were also in review. The entire European semiconductor ecosystem, already fragile after years of pandemic shortages, began to wobble again. In Brussels, trade negotiators were furious. The EU had invested billions in semiconductor sovereignty, partly to reduce dependency on China and the US. Yet now, Washington's unilateral move was freezing European innovation in real time. You cannot treat partners as collateral damage, said one senior EU official speaking on background. The impact rippled through defense contractors, autonomous vehicle developers, and even climate research centers. AI-driven simulations suddenly lacked compute power. One lab in Helsinki reported delays in training a model for renewable energy optimization. We're not building weapons, a Finnish researcher said. We're trying to save the planet. But Trump's rhetoric framed every chip as a potential weapon. He told Fox News if they get their hands on these GPUs, they can build machines smarter than our generals. I won't let that happen. His message resonated with voters wary of China's rise, but it alienated allies who saw AI as a shared frontier, not a battlefield. Behind closed doors, U.S. Tech giants pleaded for nuance. NVIDIA executives warned that the policy could backfire, pushing partners toward Chinese alternatives like Huawei's Ascend chips or new open source designs that would erode U.S. dominance. A former Commerce Department advisor described it as a geopolitical own goal. Meanwhile, China seized the opportunity. State media framed Trump's decision as proof that the West could not be trusted. Beijing accelerated domestic chip programs and began quietly supplying cheaper GPUs to Southeast Asia, a digital lifeline wrapped in political strings. For startups like Maria's, the narrative was simple but brutal. The U.S. had become unpredictable. Supply chains once built on trust were now defined by political moods. And as AI became the new oil, Washington's embargo wasn't protecting American leadership, it was drilling a hole in its own well. By late November, the phrase Blackwell shock was circulating through boardrooms and policy circles alike. Economists compared it to the 1,970 seconds oil embargo, except this time the fuel wasn't petroleum, it was compute power. The AI economy ran on silicon, and Trump had just turned off the tap. In Tokyo, a joint press briefing between Japan's trade minister and an EU commissioner tried to project calm. They called for clarity, consultation, and cooperation. But behind the podium, aides whispered about contingency plans, building local data centers with homegrown chips, accelerating research on RISC-V architectures, even negotiating side deals with Taiwan. We can't build the future of AI, one Japanese analyst said, on Trump's temper. Back in the U.S., the reaction was mixed. Wall Street worried about tech stocks, while Trump loyalists hailed the move as proof of America First too. The populist narrative played perfectly. America was cutting off the world from its genius. At a rally in Michigan, Trump declared, if they want our chips, they can build their own. No more freeloaders. But under the bravado, U.S. companies were bleeding. NVIDIA, AMD, and Broadcom quietly warned investors of billions in potential losses from canceled export contracts. Every restriction costs us market share permanently, one semiconductor executive said privately. Innovation doesn't stop, it just relocates. And relocate it did. In Singapore, Government agencies convened emergency talks with South Korean and European firms to design a new non-US AI stack. Meanwhile, Beijing stepped up its charm offensive, inviting regional partners to join a co-development initiative for open source AI hardware. Washington's control crusade was unintentionally knitting together its competitors. Maria watched the headlines unfold with disbelief. Her startup had just secured EU funding to expand production, but now she couldn't even run her machine learning models for quality control. Her investors suggested migrating operations to Canada, hoping the country might escape Trump's blacklist. But even there, the U.S. export net was tightening. She described the new normal bluntly. We used to talk about innovation speed. Now it's all about survival speed. For many in Europe's tech ecosystem, the anger wasn't just about lost access. It was about lost trust. Trump had promised to rebuild American manufacturing, yet his latest move was dismantling the very global partnerships that made Silicon Valley dominant. We're not stealing chips, one EU minister quipped. We're buying them, or at least we were. Behind the scenes, diplomats scrambled to convince Washington to carve out exemptions for allied industries. But Trump's team, emboldened by his base, refused. The message was clear. Allies would adapt or they would fall behind. For decades, America's leadership in technology was built on openness, collaboration, and credibility. Now, under Trump's second wave of tech nationalism, those very principles were being rewritten not by policy design, but by political instinct. And the cost of that instinct was only beginning to unfold. Within weeks, the Blackwell ban had turned from a policy debate into a diplomatic crisis. European leaders demanded an emergency trade dialogue with Washington. Japan and South Korea coordinated a rare joint statement urging predictability in semiconductor policy. And yet, the Trump administration remained defiant, doubling down on a message of technological sovereignty, even as America's allies began to drift. At the heart of the chaos was the absence of coordination. Unlike Biden's CHIPS Act or the EU's CHIPS joint undertaking, Trump's move carried no roadmap for shared security, no framework for exemptions, and no industrial compensation. It was pure prohibition. One White House insider, speaking to reporters off the record, admitted, "We didn't consult because we didn't want to negotiate. The president wanted a headline. He got it, and the fallout." In Brussels, the European Parliament convened an urgent session. Lawmakers warned that without U.S. chips, their AI projects could stall for months, possibly years. You can't build digital autonomy when your biggest partner pulls the plug overnight, said one member. In response, the EU quietly accelerated talks with Taiwan and India, nations now emerging as alternative suppliers in an unstable tech order. Meanwhile, inside NVIDIA's Santa Clara headquarters, engineers were reportedly instructed to prepare for a global freeze. Production schedules were rearranged. Shipments to foreign distributors were halted. A memo leaked from the company's export compliance unit described unprecedented uncertainty in license processing. Trump, unfazed, celebrated the confusion as victory. At a rally in Florida, he declared, "They laughed at us when we said we'd bring jobs home. Well, now they can't build their fancy AI without us. They'll come crawling." But even within Republican ranks, unease was growing. Several senators warned that the ban could isolate the U.S. from its most important innovation networks. Defense contractors complained that restrictions were complicating joint R&D programs with NATO allies. It's like sanctioning your own friends, one Pentagon official remarked. Maria's company, Neural Edge, was one of many caught in the middle. The startup had just secured a pilot contract with a German automaker, a deal that depended on AI-based visual inspection systems powered by NVIDIA hardware. Now, deliveries were delayed indefinitely. Her investors wanted answers. This policy isn't protecting America, she said in a frustrated Zoom call. It's punishing everyone trying to build responsibly with America. The irony was bitter. A policy meant to secure technology was destabilizing the very markets that upheld it. As one European analyst put it, if you weaponize supply chains long enough, your allies start building bunkers. Across Asia, companies began to decouple their dependency on U.S. suppliers. Vietnamese cloud startups pivoted to local AI accelerators. Singapore's data centers began testing Huawei's Ascend 910B chips despite political risk. Japan ramped up R&D funding for domestic semiconductor champions. The world wasn't waiting for Washington to calm down, it was moving on. And as the ban's shockwaves spread, the unspoken question grew louder. Was Trump protecting American power or dismantling it piece by piece in the name of control? By early December, the damage was measurable. AI firms from Helsinki to Ho Chi Minh City reported delays, layoffs, or canceled projects. Venture capital in the European tech sector dropped by nearly 30% within weeks. And as analysts began quantifying the ripple effects, one truth became impossible to ignore. Trump's Blackwell ban had fractured the global AI economy. At NVIDIA's headquarters, executives avoided cameras but leaked frustration to the press. The company's internal projections showed billions in lost foreign orders, contracts with longtime partners in Singapore, Germany, and Canada, now sitting in limbo. We can't lead an industry if our customers are treated like threats, said one senior manager. The administration, meanwhile, framed the chaos as creative destruction. In a televised briefing, Trump's trade advisor claimed the disruption would force the world to rely on American soil for innovation. But tech economists call that fantasy. Building fabrication plants, developing alternative chip designs, and scaling AI infrastructure take years, not political cycles. In the absence of clarity, allies began designing their own systems of protection. The EU drafted a Semiconductor Stability Act to shield European firms from sudden U.S. policy swings. Canada proposed bilateral talks with Japan and Taiwan to create an independent compute alliance. Even the UK, a longtime U.S. partner in defense tech, hinted at exploring non-aligned digital pathways. Inside Neural Edge's small Munich office, Maria was drafting an email to her clients. She had to explain why their AI inspection line would be postponed again. Her tone was professional, but her face betrayed exhaustion. We planned for technical failure, she told a reporter later, not political sabotage. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Trump campaign seized on the controversy as proof of strength. Fox News segments framed the ban as a triumph of economic sovereignty, painting critics as globalists and Silicon Valley appeasers. The rhetoric was blunt, the applause louder. But beneath the campaign's sound bites, a quieter panic was spreading in the tech sector. Amazon, Google, and Microsoft lobbied furiously for exemptions, warning that the policy could derail cloud partnerships that underpinned billions in AI services abroad. It's not just exports, a Google engineer noted. It's the data flows, the joint research, the trust is burning the architecture of global innovation. For Trump's inner circle, that was precisely the point. In private meetings, aides described the move as a realignment, a deliberate effort to rebuild an American first digital economy, even if it meant tearing down the old one. But without allies, the plan risked isolating the very technologies it claimed to protect. By mid-December, the first signs of that isolation appeared. AI researchers in Europe began migrating to open source ecosystems powered by Chinese hardware. Korean startups announced partnerships with Huawei. The once seamless web of US-led innovation was now fragmenting into parallel networks, each running on different chips, different laws, and different values. What began as a move to secure technology was quickly becoming a geopolitical split, a Silicon schism. And for the first time in decades, America's technological dominance no longer felt inevitable. The cracks had widened into fissures. Washington's allies, long accustomed to American unpredictability, now faced something worse, American unreliability. The Blackwell ban had metastasized beyond semiconductors into the broader question of whether the U.S. could still be trusted as the anchor of the digital world. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, European and Asian leaders arrived with one phrase echoing in private meetings: strategic autonomy. They no longer wanted to be dependent on a country that treated access to technology as a weapon of politics. A German trade official summed it up quietly: if every election in America resets global supply chains, we need our own. Trump's Commerce Department, however, dismissed the criticism as whining. In an interview, the president himself scoffed. They're mad because we're winning. If Europe wants chips, they can make them. Maybe it'll teach them to stop relying on us. But experts warned that America's manufacturing capacity wasn't ready to replace the lost global ecosystem. New fabs in Arizona and Texas were still under construction. Skilled labor shortages and high energy costs made U.S. production slower and more expensive. What Trump sold as independence looked increasingly like isolation dressed as power. Meanwhile, Beijing played a quiet, strategic game. Chinese state-owned firms began offering generous financing to Southeast Asian and Middle Eastern startups suddenly cut off from NVIDIA's chips. The pitch was simple: you don't need Washington. We can help you compute. It worked. In Jakarta, a cloud provider announced a $400 million deal with Huawei's AI hardware division. In the UAE, research institutions began switching to China's new 7 nanometers accelerators. For the first time, a non-US supply chain for high-end compute was taking shape not by design, but by opportunity. Maria watched this shift unfold with a mix of relief and dread. Her company had managed to source a batch of lower-tier GPUs from a Taiwanese distributor, but they were 2 generations behind, and her engineers struggled to adapt. Productivity fell by 40%. What's happening isn't competition, she said in a video interview. It's fracture. The world is splitting between those who can innovate and those who can't, and politics is deciding who belongs where. Across the Atlantic, Wall Street analysts began to voice the same concern. A Morgan analyst report warned that U.S. dominance in AI hardware could erode within 24 months if policy fragmentation continues. NVIDIA's stock, once invincible, lost another 12% amid mounting export restrictions and uncertain demand. Trump's response was characteristically dismissive. Stocks go up, stocks go down, he told reporters. What matters is America first. But behind the slogans, an uncomfortable truth was emerging. For decades, America's power had come not from walls, but from Webb's networks of trust, trade, and talent that spanned oceans. The Blackwell ban had sliced through those webs, leaving even America's closest partners wondering whether made in the USA was still a badge of reliability or a warning label. And while Trump called it sovereignty, the rest of the world called it something else, self-inflicted exile. The geopolitical fallout had become impossible to contain. What began as a headline about national security was now a full-blown economic contagion. The semiconductor industry, the backbone of the digital age, was fragmenting into rival camps, each trying to shield itself from the next Trump decree. In Seoul, trade ministers held late-night emergency sessions. South Korea's tech giants, already squeezed between U.S. restrictions and Chinese markets, faced an impossible choice. If we comply with Washington, we lose Asia. If we don't, we lose America, one Samsung executive told reporters. Either way, we lose. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce privately circulated a memo warning of accelerating capital flight from American tech equities. Venture capital firms were diverting funds to Europe and Japan, not because those markets were safer, but because they were less political. The memo's title was blunt: Uncertainty is the New Sanction. Back in Washington, the Trump administration doubled down. Officials framed the global backlash as proof the policy was working. They argued that if allies were scrambling, then adversaries must be panicking. But in reality, Beijing wasn't panicking, it was planning. China's semiconductor consortium, fueled by state subsidies and foreign talent fleeing Western firms, announced an ambitious goal: full-stack AI independence by 2027. The announcement, delivered on the same day Trump held a rally in Wisconsin, symbolized a quiet shift. America's control over the AI future was no longer assumed. In Brussels, Maria Alvarez joined a roundtable of startup founders. They weren't discussing innovation anymore, they were discussing survival. Neural Edge had been forced to pause its AI quality control pilot for a major automaker. Months of work, millions of euros, and investor trust, all eroded by a single policy thousands of miles away. This isn't protectionism, Maria said, her voice tight with frustration. It's vandalism. The U.S. isn't protecting its tech, it's wrecking the system that made it strong. The sentiment was spreading. Editorials across Europe and Asia echoed the same message. Trump's trade war on chips wasn't a show of power, it was proof of weakness. An America that feared competition more than collaboration was an America turning inward, haunted by its own insecurities, even within U.S. intelligence circles. Alarm bells were ringing. A leaked assessment warned that the accelerated bifurcation of global compute ecosystems could undermine Western surveillance capabilities and defense coordination. In short, by alienating allies, Trump was making America less secure. Still, the political machine rolled on. Trump's campaign team packaged the ban as a populist triumph, another win against global elites and foreign freeloaders. Supporters cheered, but behind the cheering was a quieter demographic: engineers, economists, and small business owners who understood the real cost. America's technology advantage had always been more than hardware. It was a web of trust, of open collaboration, of shared ambition across borders, but Trump's Blackwell Wall, as analysts had started calling it, was turning that web into barbed wire. And as global alliances strained, one haunting question began to echo through both Silicon Valley and Brussels. What happens when the world stops trusting the United States with its future? Global supply chains were reconfiguring themselves in real time, carving out new routes that deliberately bypassed the United States. Once, American chips were the beating heart of every major AI system. Now, firms from Frankfurt to Seoul were writing procurement contracts that began with a single clause, no U.S. dependencies. To the Trump administration, this looked like victory decoupling success, but to the rest of the world, it looked like de-Americanization of the digital age. At a defense forum in Brussels, NATO officials struggled to hide their anxiety. Their battlefield AI simulations, many of which relied on NVIDIA's GPUs and U.S. cloud infrastructure, were now facing license audits and shipment freezes. One military analyst whispered, "We can't even run a training algorithm without wondering if it breaks a U.S. rule next week." Trump, meanwhile, framed the chaos as strategic genius. They said we couldn't stop China. We stopped everyone, he boasted at a rally in Pennsylvania. Now they'll have to come back begging for American technology. The crowd cheered, but markets didn't. Semiconductor stocks slid again, and the dollar weakened as investors fled to safer currencies. In Singapore, once the rising hub of AI innovation in Southeast Asia, startup founders met under dim cafe lights to compare notes. Some were trying to buy older generation GPUs on the black market. Others considered shifting compute operations to China despite the reputational risk. "Every door is closing at once," said one developer. "Trump has turned technology into a passport and we're all stateless." Maria Alvarez watched her own company teeter between survival and collapse. Neural Edge's German investors had offered to fund a full relocation to India. "It's ironic," she said bitterly during a podcast interview. "Trump wanted to bring jobs home. He's sending ours away." She wasn't alone. Across Europe, dozens of AI startups announced layoffs or mergers just to stay afloat. Data centers stood half utilized. AI projects for healthcare diagnostics and renewable energy modeling were frozen indefinitely. Back in Washington, a rare bipartisan concern began to surface. Some Republican lawmakers, the pragmatic few, warned that Trump's unilateralism was eroding America's soft power. Democrats called it an act of technological self-harm. But within the West Wing, dissent was treated as betrayal. The president reportedly told advisors, "They can complain all they want. I make the rules now." And that was precisely the problem. In a world built on interdependence, rules made in isolation quickly became rules ignored. China seized that vacuum. Its embassies across Asia and the Middle East began offering expedited chip deals, no political strings attached, or so they claimed. Beijing wasn't just selling semiconductors. It was selling stability. Analysts in Washington privately admitted what officials refused to say aloud. The U.S. wasn't leading the tech world anymore. It was scaring it away. For decades, American innovation had been synonymous with opportunity. Now, under Trump's doctrine, it was becoming synonymous with volatility. The Silicon Curtain was rising, not between East and West, but between America and everyone else. And as Maria's final shipment of GPUs sat stalled in customs, she stared at the empty racks in her lab and murmured the quiet truth spreading across the tech world. Power without partners isn't power. its isolation with better lighting. The geopolitical echo of the Blackwell ban had reached its loudest pitch yet. Governments, investors, and tech leaders were no longer debating the policy. They were adapting to a new world where Trump's America could not be trusted to stay consistent for more than one news cycle. In Brussels, the European Commission unveiled its long-anticipated response, the Open Compute Compact. The initiative pooled resources from 27 EU nations, Japan, and Canada to create an autonomous AI infrastructure immune to U.S. export volatility. Its slogan was deliberate access, not permission. Behind the diplomatic language lay a quiet fury. Europe had built its digital economy in good faith, buying American hardware, running American software, trusting American governance. Trump had torn that faith apart with a signature and a slogan. In Washington, aides scrambled to frame the compact as anti-American, even as Wall Street analysts called it inevitable. One tech policy veteran remarked, the U.S. used to build the global standard. Now the world is building one to protect itself from us. Meanwhile, Beijing played the long game with ruthless efficiency. Subsidies for its chip makers skyrocketed. Partnerships with ASEAN nations deepened, and for the first time, Huawei's Ascend processors began powering Western startups quietly, discreetly under shell contracts routed through Dubai or Kuala Lumpur. America's export bans had not stopped Chinese chips from spreading. They had simply made the supply chain darker, more complex, and harder to control. Trump's base, however, saw none of this. The rallies grew larger, angrier, more defiant. On stage, he proclaimed, they said we'd lose friends. We didn't lose them, we exposed them. The crowd cheered. But in private, diplomats warned that exposure was turning into expulsion. European negotiators hinted that future AI security frameworks might exclude Washington entirely. Even NATO's Science and Technology Division began considering neutral data centers hosted in Switzerland, operated independently, to avoid entanglement with U.S. restrictions. Maria Alvarez watched it all unfold from her new office in Bengaluru. Neuraledge had relocated to India after months of uncertainty. The move was costly, painful, but necessary. We needed chips, she said. We didn't need permission. Her voice carried a tone of resignation and quiet defiance. From her small team's new workspace, she could see the construction of a new semiconductor fabrication plant funded jointly by Japan and India. The world was reconfiguring itself step by step away from Washington's gravitational pull. In a sense, Trump had achieved what no adversary could. He had accelerated global digital independence from the United States. He had proven that control without collaboration is not power, it's paranoia. And as Maria's engineers powered up their new servers running on Korean chips, coded in open source frameworks, she realized something profound. The future of innovation was no longer owned by one nation. It was scattered, decentralized, and politically hardened by experience. The U.S. had built the internet as a network of trust. Under Trump, it had become a fortress of fear. The question haunting boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Singapore was no longer, can America lead? It was, does the world still want to follow? What began as a single executive order had redrawn the world's technological map. Washington stood isolated, surrounded not by enemies, but by wary partners who now designed their futures to avoid dependence on the United States. The Blackwell ban had become a case study in unintended consequences. Universities, think tanks, and global media outlets dissected it relentlessly. Economists called it the Silicon equivalent of Brexit, a nationalist gamble that fractured decades of global cooperation. Even former Trump advisors quietly admitted that the administration had overreached. For Trump, though, the optics remained perfect. He had sold disruption as dominance. The chaos was proof that his decisions mattered. They're all talking about America again, he told a cheering crowd in Arizona. That means we're in charge. But the world wasn't talking about American power. It was talking about American unpredictability. In Silicon Valley, the irony was palpable. Tech executives who once worshiped the myth of the American century now whispered about the end of U.S. credibility. They had spent years building global partnerships only to watch them evaporate in a season of political theater. It's not protectionism, said one startup founder. It's sabotage disguised as patriotism. In Europe and Asia, the rebuilding had already begun. The EU's Open Compute Compact launched its first pilot data hub in Helsinki. Japan and India finalized a semiconductor supply corridor. South Korea and Taiwan agreed on a shared export verification system, one that bypassed Washington entirely. And remarkably, these nations began to thrive. Freed from American uncertainty, they built a model of pragmatic multilateralism, less ideology, more resilience. For Maria Alvarez, the change was personal. Neural Edge had survived the storm. Her engineers, once scattered across borders, were back online, their new servers humming with non-US chips. We stopped waiting for permission, she said in an interview. We learned that innovation doesn't need approval. It just needs stability. Her words became a kind of mantra across the global tech community. In industry conferences from Seoul to Stockholm, leaders quoted her as a symbol of defiance and rebirth. Meanwhile, in Washington, the tone grew darker. Trump's advisors began floating the idea of a phase 2 embargo, expanding controls to AI software, exports, and cloud partnerships. Investors recoiled. Allies rolled their eyes. It was a political performance that no longer frightened it, simply fatigued. By mid-year, U.S. companies were learning a hard truth. The world could live without them. The dependency that once gave America leverage was eroding, replaced by distributed power centers, regional alliances, and a quiet determination to never again be held hostage to one man's policy whim. Historians would later call it the Blackwell Divide, the moment America's technological empire began to decentralize, not through war or rebellion, but through exhaustion. And as the camera pans over Maria's new factory floor, bright, humming, resilient, her final voiceover cuts through the noise, calm but resolute. Trump wanted to make America strong by making everyone else weaker. But the world learned something he never did. Strength doesn't come from control. It comes from connection. The servers flicker to life. A global network hums again, not centered on Washington, but built on trust, shared across continents. The Silicon Age had survived Trump, but America's moral monopoly over it had not.